Liberal economies look at the economic buzzwords structural reforms. What does it mean? How does it impact our lives and wallets? And most importantly, when do you do them and do they even work? We'll put those questions to the man in charge of the European Commission's structural reform agenda, Pierre Moscovici. We'll then take a look at the poster child for the recovery and debate how Ireland has really made that economic comeback, and then analyse the timing of reforms in Germany. Can you ever stop, or do you keep moving with changing times? But first, let's take a look at how economics explains to us how structural reforms are supposed to lead to stability and growth.
Structural reforms are meant to make our economy flexible and more resilient to shocks. Increasing competition in the marketplace gives us more choice, and so prices fall. That leads to higher output from firms who employ more people to produce more. Long-term, wages rise. Labour market reforms, in theory, in the short term, reduce unemployment benefits and real wages. But long-term, unemployment should rise as firms can be more flexible and can employ more people. Coordinating both, economic theory tells us, can lead to stronger growth. As employees, people can work more hours and so potentially sustain the slight drop in wages. That's because households can consume more because of falling prices. Firms then increase their markup on the goods they sell. So in the long term, economics tells us, with firms selling more and employment and wages rising, the economy overall should do better.
Put it down to the luck of the Irish, but just a few years out of the Troika's bailout programme, Ireland's GDP is the envy of the Eurozone. Deficit is down, as is the unemployment rate, which is actually below the Eurozone average, and even its sovereign debt looks like it can be fixed. But as Anne Glemarek found, there is some debate about what's behind that Irish luck.
The Keogh family's been growing potatoes north of Dublin for generations. In 2011, as orders declined, Tom and his brothers had a bright idea: transform their surplus spuds into crisps.
We started this crisp business in the middle of the recession in Ireland. The business is now just gone 4 years old, and we are now employing an extra 27 people here as a direct result of the new crisp startup. And we have further plans to employ a further 12 people in 2016. We currently export about 15% of our volume to about 14 countries around the world.
While most private companies cut jobs in the wake of the nascent financial crisis in 2008, the agri-food sector was spared. Even the state cut staff, lowering civil servants' wages and raising their taxes.
When the Troika arrived at the end of 2010, salaries had already been frozen for 2 years. Public sector unions, in return for a no more job or pay cuts pledge, gave up their right to strike.
In February 2012, the unemployment rate reaches a peak of 15.1%. That's when Dublin decides to launch an action plan for jobs. Its mission was to provide training that fitted companies' needs, attract foreign investment and boost export-oriented entrepreneurship, such as Tom's business. Enterprise Ireland is one among 60 governmental agencies involved in that strategy.
Ireland is a small market, so Irish companies, when they get started, need to focus on international markets from day one. What we do is we part fund those companies, we help them to build management teams, and we help them to grow internationally.
Since 2012, this plan has resulted in 136,000 job creations. It's supported by an attractive corporate tax, which stands at between 12.5% and 25%. For economist Aidan Regan, this strategy is consistent with the policies implemented in Ireland for the past 30 years. And when asked whether structural reforms have played a role in the Irish recovery, his answer is unequivocal.
No, foreign direct investment underpins the Irish recovery, particularly exports from the US multinational. Underpinning this is the role of the state and an active enterprise and industrial policy. Central to that is, yes, a flexible labour market and a competitive corporate tax regime. The structural reforms that were recommended by the Troika in healthcare, the legal profession, were never actually implemented.
Today, many Irish are still wondering why the Troika did not restrict its mission to bank restructuring, and are looking forward to closing the chapter of austerity.
Now, this is a pretty appropriate time to bring in our guest, European Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs, Pierre Moscovici. A lot of questions being asked about Ireland's recovery. Can we give any credit whatsoever to structural reforms, or is this the result of a country being flexible?
I would say both. Even during the crisis, Ireland was an open economy, small size, with important specializations, and very flexible labour market. But at the same time, there were reforms there, as well on the fiscal side, because the country was under a programme. And now we cannot say that Ireland is a part of the movement, for example, in BEPS initiative, but also on the product and labour market. So all in all, I think flexibility and structural reforms move together.
How do you convince countries to get on board, especially when you see the slowdown that's happened in the reform process?
A lot of efforts were made in the past and are still made, so that now I would say the aggregate fiscal stance for the Eurozone is neutral and maybe slightly positive with the refugee crisis. But I think that we must also now invent reforms, I would say, for the future, not only for the past, for innovation, for the quality of public expenditures. This is something in my mind which is very important.
How do you correlate that, then, with the public perception that structural reforms equals difficult financial decisions, austerity?
It's true that for a moment, for a period, fiscal consolidation had a negative impact on growth. It is not the case anymore today. We don't have to fear reforms. On the contrary, investment, it is a matter of progress. Innovation, it is a matter of progress. Labour market reforms certainly are about flexibility, but also about security for the individuals.
Well, that brings me to a country that's facing some rather big changes to its population. Germany has an aging population. They did some major labour reforms in 2003 and did some more last year. But with a massive influx of refugees and migrants, they're now facing a rather big challenge. That brings up some questions that Guillaume Desjardins set out to explore. When do you reform, and can you ever stop?
Last year, Germany went against the tide in Europe. While the rest of the continent was tightening its belt, the country implemented a nationwide minimum wage. For workers like Marta, it was a real life changer.
I had this mini job for 3 years, and I lived the increasing of the price of the minimum amount per hour, and it was awesome.
The market in Germany has changed a lot over the last 10 years. When the reforms in 2003 were made, the purpose was to bring Germans back to work. And so they did. Over the period, unemployment was cut in half. Today, the goal is to improve the conditions of those who were left out: young workers, women and migrants.
The Schröder
reforms destroyed the labour market 13 years ago. They resulted in every good job being transformed into 3 mini-jobs or part-time jobs.
Gute Arbeit umgewandelt wurde in prekäre Beschäftigung. Aus einem Vollzeitjobs wurden 3 Minijobs.
It was really necessary to reinstate order in the labour market.
Jetzt das Ruder herumzureißen und wieder eine Ordnung auf dem Arbeitsmarkt herzustellen.
A mini-job is a labour contract that's not subject to social fees. It's cheaper for the employer, but also more flexible, as it doesn't include any schedule constraint. With more than 500,000 vacant jobs in Germany in skilled sectors such as engineering, IT or healthcare, the next challenge will be to train, attract and keep skilled workers in Germany. In the coming years, Germany will face important demographic changes. The country is getting older and older, and this will considerably change the face of its labour market.
Germany's growth has been very much dependent on exports, and we've seen positive signs in this regard in the past quarters being increasingly driven by higher domestic demand, which is precisely the type of transition that we would like to see going forward.
And these transitions will keep happening as the economy and population face up to future challenges, whether it's ageing, migration or boosting domestic markets. That means Marta and others will need to adapt constantly.
Still with us is Commissioner Moscovici. Germany's facing some rather big challenges. What do they need right now?
External surpluses of Germany, they are huge now, something like 9%. And certainly it creates an imbalance that has to be addressed. The response is clearly investment. And then comes the refugee crisis. On the economic point of view, the refugee crisis can be an opportunity.
And they're pretty skilled as well, quite a few of these refugees.
Yes, they probably are skilled, but not exactly in our standards. And again, if I look at Germany, there are needs in the labor market, and this needs public policies. Learning the language, adapting skills to labor needs. It is probably billions of euros which are needed there. So how to get that? The first origin of those funds is national. When Wolfgang Schäuble talks about a tax on oil for the refugee crisis, I'm not sure that tax, oil and refugees are very popular, but I think that the question is honorable. These debates must take place.
Okay, if we're taking that debate to a European-wide outlook, how do you address growth?
The downside risks are major. There is, of course, a look at what happens in China. There is also, of course, the level of the oil prices. And so the fact that we are not in deflation, but in a too low inflation, these are the threats for tomorrow. The refugee crisis is not economically a threat. I would say that our growth in the EU and the euro area is not so vulnerable to the outside world. If I look at the figures, Italy is now out of the recession, and Spain is above the average growth. There we have other problem of, I would say, public finances that need to be addressed, but because on the one hand you need to reform, on the other hand you need to support growth.
On that note, Commissioner, thank you very much for your insights on this issue, which I think divides a lot of people. And thank you for watching. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Goodbye.